Kubernetes 1.25 is set to drop in about 2 weeks on August 23rd, so now's not a bad time to look ahead at some forthcoming features and some forthcoming removals. So, first, just as a background, the latest version will be built with Minty Fresh Go 1.19, which was released on August 2nd. We chatted about that a bit last week. Speaking of changes under the hood, 1.25 marks a big milestone with cgroup v2 support hitting general availability. Cgroups are a key functionality of the Linux kernel that underlies containers and container orchestration. They're the mechanism by which processes are organized and apportioned resources in a configurable way. Most of our core cloud native technologies were built on cgroup v1, but after the release of cgroup v2 back in 2016, we're just now hitting the point where you can use v2 with Kubernetes in production. The expanded flexibility of cgroups v2 opens up some new options for Kubernetes users, including notably running non-root Kubernetes components and more easily running rootless containers. Those are some essential capabilities for security purposes, so it'll be great to have those ready to utilize in production in a reliable and relatively straightforward way. cgroups v2 also allows for full implementation of eBPF, or Extended Berkeley Packet Filter, the kernel functionality that sits behind technology like Cilium. So with cgroups v2 enabled, you can use the full mighty powers of Cilium, like straight up replacing kubeproxy to facilitate more performant networking and add load balancing. So cgroup v2 is a big deal all by itself. Also hitting general availability are ephemeral containers. This is a type of container intended for debugging rather than running applications. An ephemeral container isn't tied to the lifecycle of their pod, it won't restart automatically, and doesn't have any guarantees of resource availability. It's like a little maintenance ghost flitting into a pod to troubleshoot. Ephemeral containers can be particularly useful when you're using minimal images without shells, which is often sensible for speed and for security, but can hamper you a bit in debugging. We've had this feature for a while, but now it's ready for prime time. Hitting alpha is a new ability to implement user namespaces within pods. This is distinct from the cluster namespaces used by Kubernetes. Instead, these are Linux namespaces applied at the pod level. The main goal here is to provide an additional level of isolation between the pod and the host, with an eye towards security and vulnerabilities associated with container and pod escape. With user namespaces, a process in a pod can have a different user or group ID than the process running on the node, on the host. That process might have full privileges on the pod within the user namespace, but if it escapes out into the host, it will only have limited privileges there. That can really mitigate a lot of existing vulnerabilities. So while this feature is just an alpha, it's set to give us a way to add an extra layer of security to pods that might need to be highly privileged. The last big 1.25 item to discuss today isn't a new feature or graduation, but a removal. The pod security policy API will be gone as of Kubernetes 1.25 after being deprecated back in 1.21. Pod security policy was meant to provide a way to define rules for a set of pod's capabilities, but ultimately a lot of folks found that it was too confusing and encouraged overly broad defaults. Now it's being replaced with the pod security admission controller, so anyone still using pod security policy will want to migrate. The Kubernetes docs include some good instructions for migrating. We'll link those in the chat for live viewers and the show notes for podcast listeners.